right, so in our last video, we started talking about lobbying, okay, and how interest groups will use lobbyists to try to advocate for their position. Okay, so lobbying is defined as the various activities in which interest groups engage in order to influence government officials. Okay, so the different practices that interest groups will use to try to influence government officials. So we're going to talk today a little bit more specifically about how lobbyists can try to influence Congress, the executive branch, as well as the judicial branch. So starting with Congress, sometimes lobbyists will contact members of Congress directly to advocate for their group's position. So again, lobbyists are going to work on behalf of interest groups, okay, to try to forward their position on issues or try to get legislation passed on their issues. So they might reach out directly to Congress to do that. Interest groups may even offer to endorse a candidate or encourage their members to vote for a candidate. Okay, so letting that candidate know, hey, if you get this done for us, okay, we will vote for you. So that is an option that they might pursue. Lobbyists can prepare research reports and briefs to bring attention to their issues. Okay, so they are going to try to educate politicians by conducting research, providing those members of Congress with data and information. Interest groups can also draft bills, lobby members of Congress to introduce legislation, and then help them plan a legislative strategy. Okay, so they frequently are going to write legislation and even provide draft legislation for politicians to use. Okay, so they're helping members of Congress actually write legislation that can be introduced. And lobbyists may also testify about an issue in congressional committees. So back during our Congress unit, we talked about those congressional committees and how they will hold hearings on pieces of legislation to gather more information. So lobbyists can testify during those. All right, so some of the functions of interest groups here, it just kind of points out inside lobbying, that direct contact with policymakers, okay, where they give testimony or they write legislation, and then outside lobbying. So those indirect methods where they educate members on key issues, try to increase public awareness on issues, okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about grassroots lobbying efforts here in just a minute. All right, so let's talk about lobbying government agencies. So those agencies that make up the executive branch, so the bureaucracy. So interest groups are going to take advantage of federal laws that require executive branch agencies to notify the public and solicit input when establishing rules and procedures. So during the bureaucracy unit, we talked about that regulation process, where when an executive branch agency is putting out information about a regulation, okay, they have to notify the public. So interest groups take advantage of that. So interest groups will generate data, okay, and hire experts with knowledge of regulations and policies. And they'll also encourage agencies to provide benefits to the members they represent and issue favorable regulation. Okay, so they're trying to get regulation that is favorable to their interest group. Okay, so they are, again, lobbying on behalf of their interest group, trying to get laws and regulations put in place that are going to be best for their particular interest group. And they try to do that, again, through motivating the public, okay, to become involved in those activities. And then we have influencing the judiciary. So interest groups are going to try to shape how laws can be interpreted by the judiciary. And this can be done, first of all, through a lawsuit, and second, through a amicus curiae brief. So interest groups can weigh in on a case filed by other parties by filing a friend of the court brief. So that amicus curiae brief. So this is going to describe the group's position on issues in an attempt to persuade the court. So we know that during a Supreme Court case, there are two parties, okay? And essentially, interest groups can try to weigh in on how the court may rule by filing that friend of the court brief. So by filing those briefs, those groups are attempting to influence how laws in their policy area will be interpreted in the future. Okay, so how might these particular laws be interpreted moving forward? Okay, so that's how interest groups and lobbyists can work to influence the judiciary. All right, so we also have talked about iron triangles and issue networks before. So we talked about them in terms of Congress, but we're going to revisit it here just a little bit, kind of refresh your memory on what the iron triangle is. So we know that the iron triangle has the 3 different points, okay? And that is the depiction of the connection between interest groups, Congress, and the bureaucracy. So this is going to be a mutually beneficial network or connection between those 3 groups. So the term is actually defined as those, iron triangles is going to be how those 3 groups work together, okay? So they offer support to members of Congress who serve on committees related to their policy area. So interest groups are providing information, and then in return, members of Congress are going to take interest groups' agenda into consideration. Interest groups can also provide congressional support for bureaucratic agencies and priorities. And in return, bureaucratic agencies are going to offer favorable implementation of legislative policies and friendly regulation. So interest groups, okay, provide electoral support to Congress. In turn, they get friendly legislation. Okay, and then interest groups can offer congressional support via lobbying to the bureaucracy, and in return, they get low regulation. So this is how they work together in ways that are mutually beneficial. The term issue network is used to describe webs of influence between interest groups, policymakers, and policy advocates. So issue networks can temporarily unite groups that are normally on different sides of issues. So the big thing to know about the iron triangle and issue networks is these are just ways that interest groups and policymakers all work together. All right, let's talk a little bit about money and campaigns. Okay, so one big thing to note is that interest groups and political parties are not the same thing. So make sure that you are aware that they're not the same. Now, interest groups will sometimes have policy goals that are aligned with one party more so than another. So, for example, the Democratic Party would be aligned with environmental groups. Okay, so that's just one example. And this, on the same note, the NRA, which supports guns, are going to be more supportive of the Republican Party. So they're not the same, but they can share similar goals. So interest groups can become heavily involved in the campaign process because, as we have already talked about, you really need money for media coverage and then the campaign research. So campaigns need a lot of money to be successful. So an interest group could potentially form a political action committee, those PACs, to give money directly to a candidate or form a super PAC to run its own ads independent from a candidate's campaign. So interest groups often form those political action committees. They can contribute to campaigns. Now, again, the political action committees are limited to how much they can donate, but they can donate, okay? Or they can form those super PACs and just run advertising that is completely separate from a campaign and spend as much money as they want to. So that's how interest groups can be involved in that campaign and election process. So next, let's talk a little bit about grassroots lobbying and what it is or what it means. So grassroots lobbying is when they're putting pressure on politicians by calling on their members to contact politicians and essentially advocate for their political goals. So interest groups can use that grassroots lobbying to mobilize their members to really pressure their elected representatives directly. So that can be through phone calls, through emails, and social media. So interest groups that aren't necessarily well funded can use this tactic because it's relatively inexpensive, but it can still be effective. So for example, a protest, okay? So interest groups can hold a protest, doesn't take a whole lot of funding, but protests can sometimes lead to media attention, okay, which can help to grow their cause, gain support for their cause or their position on certain issues. All right, and last, we're going to talk a little bit about social movements. So social movements often use protests and civil disobedience, which can be powerful and effective tactics in altering the political agenda. So interest groups can sometimes support these social movements. So social movements are really broad-based coalitions of groups and individuals that are advocating for some sort of social change. Okay, so social movements can happen for a variety of reasons, whether it be for social change or group rights or current issues. Okay, so things like women's rights, civil rights, environmental issues, consumer rights. Okay, so social movements can start for all kinds of issues. Interest groups will often support these social movements. Okay, so social movements are generally going to be much more broad, whereas interest groups are generally going to be more concerned with specific issues. So multiple interest groups may support a social movement. So a big part of social movements often are protests, okay, because again, they can attract media attention, okay, and force the public and policymakers to confront it. But again, just make sure that you know the difference between the two. Okay, so social movements, again, are very broad, whereas interest groups are generally more specific on a specific issue, but interest groups will generally support a social movement. So, for example, we have that Black Lives Matter movement that has been going on and really has been brought to attention more recently. Okay, so the NAACP is an interest group that has supported that movement. All right, so that is where we are going to stop with this video.